calmest I have ever sounded in my life was the moment I set my father's keys on the podium in front of 300 people, smiled, and said, "Congratulations. It's all yours. I'm Marin Whitlock. I'm 35. And for 5 years, I slept in hospital recliners, memorized medication schedules, canceled my own future, and held together a company that should have collapsed twice, so that the man at that podium could stand up in a gold-lit ballroom and announce that the legacy, the company, the name, all of it, would go to my sister. Camille had been home for 9 weeks. 9 weeks. That was all it took for my father to clear his throat like a king rewriting history and tell a room full of investors, partners, relatives, and reporters that she was the future of Whitlock Contract Interiors. My share, apparently, was $50,000, a thin smile from the family attorney, and a gentle suggestion that I finally go do something for myself. I remember the weight of the keys in my palm. I remember the way Camille's pale silk dress caught the chandelier light while she looked at me like I was supposed to be grateful for being dismissed so cleanly. And I remember the exact second my father opened the envelope the courier handed him. The second his face changed before he even reached the second line. The color climbed up his neck. His hand tightened on the paper. Then he looked straight at me across that room and shouted, "You can't be serious." I didn't shout back. I just sat there, smiled once, and let the first domino fall. Welcome back to Suspense Stories, where the quietest people in the room are usually the ones holding the truth. Before I tell you what was in that envelope, and why the rest of that night took apart everything they thought they controlled, do me a favor. Tell me what time it is where you are, and what city you're watching from. I genuinely want to know how far this story travels before you decide whether I was cruel or just finally finished being invisible. 5 years ago, I was not planning revenge. I was planning a launch. I had a pitch deck open on my laptop, a flight booked to Denver, and a business I had been quietly building in my head for almost a year, a design studio for healthcare and hospitality spaces, the kind of firm that asks not, "How do we make this look expensive?" but "How does a person feel in this room on the worst day of their life?" I had one investor breakfast left before I could stop freelancing and make it real. Then my father collapsed in the showroom, a ruptured artery, emergency surgery. The surgery led to complications. The complications led to months of rehab, and the months became years of half recovery, stubbornness, and endless management. He survived, but not cleanly. He could still make decisions, still bark orders, still insist he was perfectly fine. But he could not run his life the way he used to, and he absolutely could not keep Whitlock Contract Interiors standing without someone doing the invisible work underneath him. Whitlock was my grandfather's company. Hal Whitlock started it after the war with one workbench and a single oak armchair he'd built for a veterans hospital that couldn't afford real furniture. By the time I was born, it was a mid-sized contract furnishings house in St. Louis. We outfitted hospitals, university residence halls, hotels, senior living communities, the waiting rooms and patient floors and family lounges that nobody photographs, but everybody passes through on the hardest days of their lives. For years, my father had treated it like a throne. Overnight, it became an ICU patient with a payroll. My mother had already been gone 2 years by then, and my sister Camille was in Los Angeles building what she called a lifestyle design brand, which mostly meant expensive brunches, borrowed handbags, and captions about feminine leadership written under sponsored posts. So I stayed. I canceled the investor breakfast. I moved into my father's house temporarily. I learned to read cardiology discharge notes, compare insurance appeals, schedule physical therapy transport, and rebuild whole product lines, because the showroom that once mocked anything too soft now needed me to renegotiate a fabric contract from a hospital waiting room. I answered supplier emails at 4 in the morning. I rebid a freight contract during a follow-up appointment. I built weekly cash flow sheets in the corner while his speech therapist worked with him. I let my apartment lease auto-renew for 18 months without really living in it. I told myself it wasn't forever. I told myself family remembers who stood beside them when everything fell apart. That lie lasted longer than it should have. My father recovered enough to chair meetings again, but only because I handled everything no one applauds. The vendor disputes, the payroll timing, the flooring recall that could have become a lawsuit, the 2 operations managers who quit in 1 quarter, the hospital client who threatened to walk during a billing error that wasn't even ours. Publicly, he was back. Privately, he leaned on me for nearly every real decision that kept the company breathing. And here is the part I'm not proud of. I was good at being invisible. I was so good at holding everything together quietly that everyone, including me, started treating my strength as a service instead of a self. But there was a second timeline running underneath the first one. While my father slept off post-surgical pain, and Camille posted throwback photos from Malibu captioned "Soft Life, Strong Standards," I was still feeding the dream I'd postponed the night of that canceled breakfast. It started small because it had to. A redesign for a community clinic's intake area. A family lounge concept for a children's rehab center in Colombia. A patient room refresh for a small hospital that couldn't afford the big firms. I worked after midnight with a blanket around my shoulders and one eye on the little camera we'd put in my father's room after his second fall. I built it all under an LLC I named Northlight Studio. I didn't use $1 of family money. I didn't take a single Whitlock client. I didn't break one rule. I just used what I'd learned keeping my father's company alive, and what I'd learned sleeping in those recliners. And I turned it into something that belonged to me, because I knew something the big firms didn't. I knew what it feels like to need a chair that turns into a bed at 2 in the morning. I knew what it costs a family when the only private place to cry is a stairwell. I knew that a gown that doesn't expose a frightened person is not a small thing. It's the difference between dignity and despair. I had lived inside the exact rooms I was now designing, and grief had taught me more than any showroom ever could. There was one night that crystallized all of it. Somewhere in the second year, 3 in the morning, my father finally asleep after a stretch of chest pain that turned out to be nothing, and terrified us both anyway. I was in the hard vinyl chair beside his bed, the one the hospital generously calls a family recliner, which is a generous name for a chair that punishes you for trying to rest in it. My back ached. My laptop was open on my knees, and instead of sleeping, I found myself sketching, not for Whitlock, not for anyone, just for me, a version of that exact chair that a person could actually sleep in. One that didn't make you choose between watching the people you love and being a human being with a spine. I drew it 3 times before the sun came up. I didn't know it yet, but that drawing became the first product Northlight ever sold. The family bed chair in every Rivermark room today started as a 3A. Act of quiet rebellion against a piece of furniture that was hurting me while I held everyone else together. The first year, Northlight covered its own software and taxes. The second year, it let me start saying no to work I hated. The third, I hired a contract drafter and a part-time project manager. By the fourth year, I quietly realized I wasn't building a side project anymore. I was building an exit. If this story is hitting somewhere real for you, if you've ever been the strong one, the dependable one, the one everybody leans on and nobody thanks, do me a favor and subscribe to Suspense Calm Stories and leave the words, "Hold the room," in the comments. I read them, and I want to know who out there has been quietly carrying something heavy. Now, let me tell you about the contract that changed everything. The biggest break came 6 months before Camille flew back to St. Louis. A regional health system called Rivermark Health, 12 hospitals across 3 states, put out a call for a partner to redesign their patient rooms and family spaces, system-wide. Not a furniture order, a whole philosophy. They wanted dignity. They wanted a family-centered experience. They wanted the kind of design that makes a terrified person feel held instead of processed. Whitlock Contract Interiors had already tried to win it. I knew because I had helped assemble my father's original pitch packet before I understood what I was looking at. Their proposal led with the word prestige 11 times. It talked about award-winning aesthetics and signature finishes. It was beautiful and expensive and completely deaf to what Rivermark was actually asking for. They wanted to be understood. My father offered to impress them. Rivermark passed, so I submitted through Northlight Studio. No family name attached. My proposal didn't lead with prestige. It led with a single line I'd carried in my head for 5 years, a line I later learned my grandfather had written in the front of his old sketchbook in 1953. A room has one job, to hold a person on the day they can't hold themselves. I built the whole pitch around that. Lighting you can dim from the bed, so a sleeping child isn't woken for vitals. A family chair that becomes a real bed without an aide having to wrestle it. A window seat positioned so a person saying goodbye can do it facing the light instead of the door. Storage for the small human things, a phone charger, a paperback, a kid's stuffed animal, because those are what people actually clutch at 3 in the morning. It wasn't soft. It was the most rigorous thing I'd ever made, because I'd lived every assumption in it. That proposal got me to the final round. The final round got me a confidential interview. The interview turned into a draft agreement worth just over $4 million, a multi-year, multi-site transformation. Enormous for a firm my size. Still completely plausible for the scope. I hadn't signed it yet. I kept telling myself I could do 1 more year for my father, then leave cleanly, on good terms, with everyone's blessing. Then Camille came home, and my family decided I was worth $50,000 and a pat on the head. She arrived in a black SUV with 6 matching suitcases, and the kind of confidence people mistake for competence when they already want to believe the story. She hugged my father hard, cried at exactly the right volume, and within 48 hours, she had rewritten the family narrative. Her years away became international brand exposure. Her total absence during his rehab became respecting Dad's dignity, while Marin handled the day-to-day. That was how 5 years of unpaid labor, postponed ambition, and grief got translated at our dinner table. The day-to-day, at the first family dinner after she returned, Camille swirled sparkling water in a wine glass and said, in front of my Aunt Carol and 2 board advisors, "Marin is wonderful at the caretaking side of things. Truly. But running the future of a company, that takes a different kind of muscle." My father nodded. He actually nodded. I felt my hand tighten around my fork until my knuckles went white, and no one noticed. Or maybe they did and decided it was easier not to. That was the night I finally understood the thing I'd been refusing to see for 5 years. I had not been loved for my sacrifices. I had been used by them. And the moment they decided I was no longer necessary, they wanted me to disappear, neatly, gratefully, quietly. Have you ever felt yourself being erased while you were still sitting at the table? That was the exact sensation. Not heartbreak, erasure. What they didn't know was that disappearing had never actually been my talent. Surviving quietly was. Building quietly was. The day after my father told me, privately, that he intended to transfer majority control and most of the estate to Camille, the family attorney sent me a packet. Inheritance waiver. Transfer acknowledgement. House access turnover. A surrender of the power of attorney I'd held through 5 years of his recovery. Quiet exit language dressed up as concern. And buried in the middle of it, a 5-year non-compete tied to Whitlock Contract Interiors, and any directly competitive work in contract interiors, healthcare environments, or hospitality design. It would have caged me if I had ever signed on as an executive or an employee. But I hadn't, not formally. For 5 years, my father had delayed giving me the title I'd earned, because titles mean leverage, salary, and documented value, and he wanted obedience without structure. He wanted a daughter he could call indispensable in private and unofficial in public. It turned out to be the most expensive mistake he ever made. I took the papers to Maeve Sullivan, a lawyer I had quietly hired 2 years earlier, the first time I realized I might one day need protection from my own family. Maeve has the kind of mind that turns rage into precision. She read everything, tapped the table once, and said, "He's trying to push you out fast because he assumes you have nowhere to go." Then she looked up. "You do have somewhere to go, don't you?" I showed her the Rivermark draft. She read it, set it down, and said the sentence that changed the temperature of my entire body. "Marin, this non-compete can't reach work you built independently before any of this, when you were never once classified as an officer of the company. In plain English, your father tried to erase your authority so completely that he also erased his power to contain you. He can't cage a daughter he refused to put on the org chart." For a second, I couldn't speak. 5 years of exhaustion, and grief and guilt and loyalty all met that one legal fact and turned into something clean and quiet. Not rage, clarity. Maeve and I spent the next 2 days building a timeline. Every email, every invoice, every contract, every calendar record showing exactly what I had done for Whitlock and what I had built separately after hours with my own hands. And we made one more decision together about the dinner. Whitlock hosted one major event every spring, a partner dinner for board members, investors, top clients, and a few friendly reporters. This year's, at the Ardmore Ballroom downtown, was meant to introduce Camille as the next face of the company and reassure the market that the family succession was strong and graceful and inevitable. My father had personally invited the Business Journal, a newspaper columnist he liked, and 2 trade reporters, because he wanted the handoff to look modern and unstoppable. Maeve looked at that guest list and said very calmly, "Good. If they want theater, we'll give them documentation." I didn't want a meltdown. I didn't want screaming. I wanted something far harder for them to survive, a public correction. So that night, in the room where I'd once taped color-coded medication charts inside a closet door, I wrote the letter my father would later open with his face going red. I didn't make it cruel. I made it accurate. I told him exactly what 5 years had cost me. I told him that every time he praised Camille's vision, he was praising confidence built on work she had never done. I told him that while he was preparing to reward appearance, I had been preparing to step fully into value. And I told him that by the time he finished reading, he would finally understand what it means to misprice a daughter. The last 2 days before the dinner were not glamorous. They were surgical. Camille drifted through the house like the ending had already been filmed in her favor. She had a stylist come for fittings. She rehearsed an acceptance speech in the breakfast room with a ring light balanced on my grandfather's old cookbooks. She told one of our longtime install managers that legacy companies need fresh, aesthetically literate leadership now. A sentence so empty, I almost admired it. Then she crossed a line she never should have touched. I overheard her telling my father that once the transfer was done, they'd need to let go of the deadweight, older staff who were too emotionally attached to Marin's way of doing things. She meant Teresa in client accounts, who had covered for me during 3 different hospital crises. She meant Danny on the install crew, who'd driven to a job site at midnight so I wouldn't have to leave my father's bedside. She meant Dawn in procurement, who missed her own son's birthday because my family's emergency had quietly become her problem too. Those were the people who'd helped me hold the company together while my father relearned how to climb stairs. And my sister was already planning to throw them away to make room for her glow up. That was the night any softness I had left toward this version of my family went cold and stayed cold. Later, I opened a storage bin in the back of my closet and found my grandfather's sketchbook, Hal's, the worn leather one my father had banished to a back shelf years ago because it didn't fit the brand. I opened it to that first page, the one written in 1953. A room has one job: to hold a person on the day they can't hold themselves. Underneath it, in the same careful hand, we don't sell furniture. We sell a promise that somebody can rest here. My father had spent 20 years turning that promise into a price tag. I had spent 5 years, without even realizing it, keeping it alive. And tucked into the back of that sketchbook, in my mother's handwriting, was a note I'd never seen. 4 lines. Marin, you were never born to carry other people forever. Learn the difference between love and disappearance. When your moment comes, do not shrink to make anyone else comfortable. Build the room you needed. I sat on the floor with that note for a long time. Then I folded it, put it in my blazer pocket, and went back to work. If you're still with me, here's where it turned. And if you've ever watched a family hand the credit to the one who showed up last, drop the words "seen too late" in the comments, because that's the feeling I want to talk about for a second before the dinner. The hardest part of being the dependable one isn't the work. It's watching everyone decide your endurance was just your personality. Okay, the Ardmore Ballroom. The ballroom looked exactly the way my father liked power to look. Gold light, polished glass, expensive smiles. Enough important people in one room to make him feel immortal. By the time dessert was cleared, Camille was glowing in pale silk, already accepting congratulations for something that hadn't been made official yet. Maeve had coordinated everything cleanly and legally. Rivermark had agreed to release a short statement that same evening, but only if my father forced the succession reveal in public, which we both knew he would, because men like my father cannot resist a stage once they believe they own the ending. The event's tech team had a partner announcement asset queued under Northlight Studios, pending press release, with written confirmation that a final partner segment might need to run. We didn't hack anything. We didn't sabotage anything. We simply made sure the truth had a microphone, and Dr. Nathan Reyes, the physician who runs Rivermark Health, agreed to sit quietly at the back of the room with his head of strategy. A sharp, contained man with zero patience for family theatrics and every appetite for clean execution. On the phone that afternoon, he told me, "I have no use for nepotism, Marin, but I do love a precise reveal. Send me the timing." My father stepped to the podium and began the speech he'd clearly rehearsed for days: legacy, resilience, the future of Whitlock, as if the last 5 years had simply arranged themselves around him. Then he said Camille's name, and the room began to applaud. That was when the courier arrived with the envelope. He signed for it with visible irritation, opened it casually, and then everything changed. His eyes crossed the page once, then again. The color climbed his neck. He looked straight at me and shouted, "You can't be serious." The applause died instantly. Camille froze at the podium, still smiling half a second too long before panic finally reached her face. I stood slowly and said, "You should keep reading." Behind Camille, the presentation screen changed. Her title slide vanished. The Northlight Studio logo took its place. A low wave of confusion moved through the room. Then Dr. Nathan Reyes stood up at the back and introduced himself. My father recognized the name immediately. He'd lost to Rivermark's rejection just months before. Camille clearly had no idea who he was. Calmly, Reyes explained that Rivermark Health had awarded its system-wide patient and family environment program, 12 hospitals, 3 states, a multi-year transformation, not to Whitlock Contract Interiors, but to Northlight Studio. The firm, he said, that had submitted the only proposal in the room that understood what a hospital is actually for. The screen shifted again to my name, founder and principal designer. Below it, the project metrics, the client list, the work I had built independently after midnight between hospital calls without $1 of family money. Camille tried to call it a misunderstanding, but the room had already turned. Reporters were typing. Investors were whispering. Board members were staring at my father instead of applauding his chosen heir. I walked to the stage and took the microphone, and for the first time in 5 years, I introduced myself properly. I told them that while my family had reduced half a decade of my life to the caretaking side of things and a $50,000 exit, I had been quietly building something real, legally, independently, on my own name. I told them what the Rivermark contract was worth. And then I told them why I'd won it. Whitlock pitched them prestige, I said. I pitched them a chair that becomes a bed at 2 in the morning because I have slept in that chair. I pitched them a window a dying man can face instead of a door because I have stood at that window. My grandfather started this company on one promise, that a room should hold a person on the day they can't hold themselves. Somewhere along the way, this family decided that promise wasn't profitable enough. I just spent 5 years keeping it alive without anyone noticing. My father said I had turned against the family. I answered with the only thing that was true. No, I just stopped letting this family call my labor love and price it like convenience. A reporter asked Camille one basic question about the company's actual operations, and she couldn't answer it. A board member asked my father whether he had truly planned to hand the company to someone with 9 weeks of staged involvement while pushing out the daughter who'd carried it for 5 years. He said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. I walked to the podium, and I set it all down in front of him. The signed inheritance waiver, the surrendered power of attorney, the house keys, the office keys, the access cards. You wanted everything back, I said quietly. Congratulations. Then I stepped away from the microphone, shook Dr. Ray's hand, and walked out while the room came apart behind me, not with drama, but with consequences. By the time I reached the ballroom doors, Camille was no longer the future of Whitlock Contract Interiors. She was just the woman standing under the lights when the truth finally arrived. The fallout started before I reached the valet stand. By the time I got into my car, Maeve had already forwarded me 3 messages from reporters, 2 from prospective clients, and 1 from a private equity observer who'd been in the room and wrote only 4 words. You changed that room. Overnight, the story moved through St. Louis business circles faster than any official statement could chase it. The Business Journal ran it first. Overlooked daughter appends family succession at Whitlock dinner. The newspaper version was quieter and somehow harsher. Because it focused on the governance failure, investors care far less about family drama than about leadership that can't answer a basic question. And my father had accidentally staged both at once. By the next morning, the Whitlock board called an emergency meeting without Camille in the room. By noon, my father had been stripped of unilateral succession authority pending review. By that afternoon, Camille's transition announcement had been paused indefinitely, a phrase that made me laugh harder than it should have, but the consequences got heavier fast. 2 hospital partners requested written clarification about leadership stability. A hotel group delayed a renewal, and 3 of the employees I had trained called me that weekend, asking whether Northlight Studio was hiring. One of them cried before she finished her second sentence, because she'd been told that staying loyal to Marin's way had made her disposable. I hired 2 of them within 10 days. Teresa was the first. Camille fought back where people like Camille always start: image. She posted a black and white story about betrayal from those who resent feminine leadership. Within an hour, people were screen recording clips from the dinner and posting them beside her caption, because the woman preaching leadership hadn't been able to answer a single question about the company she was supposed to run. 2 brand partnerships quietly disappeared from her profile inside a week. I did not enjoy that, but I also did not rescue her from it. My father called 3 times in 5 days. I ignored the first 2. On the 3rd, I answered because I was done being haunted by a ringtone. He skipped the apology and went straight to negotiation, which was very him. We need to discuss stabilizing market confidence, he said. Not I hurt you, not I was wrong. Market confidence. You need to discuss it, I said. I'm fine. He exhaled sharply. Don't do that. Don't act like this isn't still your family. I let the silence sit. Then I said, family was the word you used when you needed sacrifice. Business was the word you used when you denied me value. You don't get to switch definitions just because the room turned on you. He asked for a meeting. I gave him one a week later at my office on my schedule, with Maeve present and every word documented. By then, Northlight Studio had subleased a glass front suite in a converted warehouse downtown. Not huge, but real. My lease, my team, my name on the door. My father arrived 10 minutes early and looked around the space like he was trying to understand how it had existed without his permission. He did not bring Camille. The smartest decision he made all month. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. He came in offering partnership language and left having learned what boundaries sound like from a daughter who no longer needs permission to set them. I told him plainly, I would not rejoin Whitlock. I would not become its hidden fixer again. I would not soften the public version to make him comfortable. If Whitlock ever wanted to work with Northlight, It would be project by project, at market rate, with documented scope and no authority handed to Camille. He called the terms insulting. Maeve called them generous. The board, when they saw the draft, called them necessary. And the most painful part for him was not the money. It was structural. For the first time in his life, he had to accept terms from me because he no longer had the leverage to dictate them. There was one aftershock I didn't expect. Sorting old files for Maeve, I found a storage receipt in my mother's name, a unit she'd rented before she died. Inside were boxes of my old sketchbooks, school drawings, and a second letter, sealed, addressed to me, that I'd somehow missed the night before the dinner. She wrote that she had always worried I was becoming too good at surviving without a witness. She wrote that some daughters get so competent inside other people's crises that everyone starts mistaking their strength for a service instead of a self. And she ended with a line I keep in a frame on my desk now. When people confuse your endurance for your purpose, build your own room and leave the door open only for the ones who knock. That letter did not make me softer toward my father. It made me steadier. 9 months later, Northlight Studio had the whole floor. 14 people, a dozen clients, and a reputation for turning anxious, institutional, forgettable spaces into rooms that actually hold the people inside them. Rivermark expanded our contract. A children's hospital signed with us. A senior living group from Minneapolis told me they chose us because, in their words, your work sounds like it was made by someone who's actually had to hold a life together in one of these rooms, not just photograph one. That line stayed with me a long time. A few months into the Rivermark rollout, I walked through the first finished floor at one of their hospitals, a quiet oncology wing in a small town I'd never been to. There was a man asleep in one of our bed chairs, fully reclined, a paperback open on his chest, beside a bed where his wife was resting. A nurse who didn't know who I was told me the families on that floor had started calling it the room where you can actually breathe. I stood in that hallway a long time. 5 years earlier, a chair like the one that man was sleeping in had not existed, because no one who designed those rooms had ever been forced to sleep in one. I had. That was the whole difference. Everything my family had called my weakness, the staying, the caretaking, the years no one applauded, was the exact thing that let me build a room a stranger could finally rest in. They thought they were burying my career under my father's illness. They were handing me the only education that ever mattered. Success felt quieter than people imagine. Better sleep, cleaner numbers, a calendar that belonged to me, the ability to leave the office at 7 on a Thursday and know that no one could call me back into being invisible. Camille and I crossed paths alone for the first time at Thanksgiving at Aunt Carol's while everyone else argued over pie. She looked different without the performance layer, quieter, more tired, less hollow. I was awful to you, she said, by the sink. Not just at the dinner. For years, I looked at her and said, yes. She nodded like she deserved that answer, because she did. Then she asked if I thought people could change after being handed things they hadn't earned. Some can, I said, if the humiliation doesn't become their whole personality. It wasn't forgiveness. It was the first honest conversation we'd ever had. My father took longer. He asked for a meeting a month later, not about contracts, just coffee. I almost said no. Then I remembered that boundaries are stronger when you choose them than when you hide behind them. So I said yes. A hotel lobby in daylight, 40 minutes. He looked older, less armored. He didn't start with market language. He started with, I was wrong. Then more slowly, awkwardly, like apology was a language he'd been forced to learn too late in life. He admitted he had mistaken my loyalty for availability, my competence for duty, and Camille's polish for readiness. "I thought you could take it," he said, "because you always did." "That was the problem," I answered. "You treated my capacity like consent." He closed his eyes for a second. "I don't think men like my father enjoy being understood that precisely." He asked whether I could ever trust him again, and I told him the truth. That trust isn't a speech or a dinner or one emotional cup of coffee. Trust is pattern, distance, respect, follow through over time. And even then, not everything that breaks goes back to what it was. He nodded. He didn't argue. That mattered more than anything he could have said. In the spring, Whitlock and Northlight collaborated on exactly one project, a single hospital wing, under the precise terms I'd set. No family language, no hidden labor, no assumptions, just scope, invoices, and accountability. It went well, not because we'd healed magically, but because I had finally stopped walking into any room where my value depended on love being interpreted correctly. My grandfather's sketchbook sits open on a shelf in my studio now, turned to that first page from 1953. The old oak armchair he built for that veterans' hospital, the one my father exiled to a back room, sits in my lobby, where every client who walks in gets to rest in it before we talk. And the house keys I handed my father that night. He mailed them back to me a year later, with a note that said only, "It was always more yours than mine." I keep them in a glass box on the bookshelf. One of my younger designers asked me once why I'd frame a set of keys to a house I no longer live in. I told her, because returning something is not always a loss. Sometimes it's proof that you finally understand it was never really yours to carry. So, if you were sitting where I sat that night, letter on the table, keys in your hand, your father red-faced in front of a ballroom that finally saw the truth, would you have done what I did? Would you have walked out with a calm smile? Or would you have stayed long enough to make them feel every second of being seen too late? Tell me in the comments. And if this story reached you, leave the word Northlight, so I know who out there is done being someone else's invisible foundation. Thank you for staying with me through this one. Every character and event here is fictional, written only for reflection and dramatic entertainment. But the truth underneath it isn't fiction. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't hurting anyone back. It's finally understanding your own worth, refusing to be priced like a convenience, and building a room where respect is no longer up for negotiation. This has been Suspense Calm Stories. I'll keep the light on.